I felt my stomach rise into my mouth as the plane leveled out and prepared its descent into Yangon. It was daunting. It was intimidating. After all, here we were arriving in this foreign country, in this new place. It was David's introduction to Asia, and it was only my second time to anywhere in Asia. We had no idea what to expect. The city of Yangon was perfect for a couple days. It was full of exciting food and a wide diversity of people and streets to explore. And then the main pagoda is a sight to behold. Sitting high up on a hill, you go and when you reach it, you take these escalators up. And these escalators, many of the locals who are obviously have come in from the countryside or poorer parts of the city, have never encountered an escalator before. And if you remember back to when you first encountered it, it's a scary experience, right? And so here, there's the awe of the architecture, the majesty of it, and then this technology juxtaposed upon it. And so we joined them as they jumped and carefully worked their way onto the escalators. Then it was our turn to be in shock and awe as we made our way through and past all of the different pagodas. The monks, the locals, everyone was as curious about us as we were about them. That's not to say that there's some grand shortage of tourists or Westerners. No, there's quite a few of us there. Not as many as I expected, but still, we're not that exotic. But it's still this curiosity about culture. At one point, David and I got stopped, and next thing we knew, we had probably taken photos with 10 different groups of people. They just kept lining up. And it was at that moment that I felt a little bit less bad about my curiosity, my desire to document and to photograph people on the streets, people going about their daily lives. We explored surrounded by this beautiful combination of different pillared pagodas, and then with the great grand golden spire that of course everything is based around, before making our way back down. And then that's when the next leg of our adventure began. We decided that we were not going to fly, but we were going to do an overnight bus. And that overnight bus, it was something that I was terribly afraid about. You can read it in my blog post. But so we get on that bus, and it ends up being incredibly comfortable. And so we watch movies, we sleep, they serve us food. The following morning, we wake up in Bagan. Now, Bagan was one of the places more than anywhere else that I had dreamed of visiting, because it's right up there with Angkor Wat, one of the great Southeast Asian empire, city, structure, palaces, temple complexes. At its peak, there were more than 10,000 different structures that were there. Now, most of these have been destroyed by earthquakes, and of course, this past August, there was just a great quake that damaged many of the 2,000 or so that are still there. But the thing about the place is that it's still raw and untouched. And even though it's Myanmar's largest tourist attraction, you still have so many small pagodas and small temples divided up and spread over the whole valley that you rent these electric bikes, which was another shock, and you pay $5-6 a day. And then you wander around exploring on your own, going down small dirt paths, finding small little temples, small little pagodas, scaling some of the larger ones to watch the sunrise and the sunset. And all the while around you, you're surrounded by people going about their daily business, gathering water from the local river, you name it. And so these temples that have been occupied and looked after and preserved for hundreds of years date back to an empire that was huge and dominant in the region until Genghis Khan and his descendants put them under enough pressure that their empire collapsed. It's detail where the places and the finesse and the small temples and the small winding zigzaggy dirt sandy paths are the richness. They're what make it a place that you can spend 2-3 days lost in just wandering. Whereas if you just spent time 1 or 2 days at the largest pagoda, perhaps then you would be satiated. Our time in Bagan was all too brief because then we needed to continue on. So again, we piled into a minivan, an 11-person minivan, and we had a 10-hour winding adventure that took us through dramatic switchbacks and beautiful tiny little Myanmar villages to Inle Lake. Now, Inle Lake was one of the other places that I absolutely had to go because it's famous for these fishermen who, not so much anymore, but used to, and still to a lesser extent do, fish with these large nets that are within a wooden circular construct. And they drop these into the lake because the lake is incredibly shallow, almost like a throw net would work, but without the weights or before the weights. And then they'll fish that way. But what makes it even more special and even more dramatic and even more impressive is that these fishermen stand on their floating canoes, their dugout canoes, with one leg, the other leg used to paddle and maneuver the boat, while they're simultaneously maneuvering these giant nets. Now, you and I probably would struggle to stand on one leg for more than 30 seconds standing on dry land, let alone rowing a boat while there's waves and wake action and everything else with one leg while standing on one leg. It's an incredible sight to behold. Inle Lake and the village around it's also surrounded by these gorgeous rice fields, which were in the process of being planted. And it's incredible spending time with the women. Typically, it's mostly women that are planting these fields, up to their knees in mud and muck and water, with these small bushels of baby rice, and planting them incredibly quickly, covering a large amount of ground, a large amount of crop, a large amount of field very quickly. Of course, that gives you that kind of quintessential Asian view as you look out and you see these flooded fields with gorgeous, vibrant green stalks in perfect lines sprouting up. On top of getting around the lake with the longboats, which are different than longboats or longtail boats that you would see elsewhere and very shallow in draft, there's villages that are largely sitting on pillars or floating above the water. And these aren't small gatherings or small groups or a couple lone buildings. These are whole villages, including post offices and everything in between. So you navigate through these, and there's hotels and all of these different structures. Literally people living above the water. There's also a floating garden, tomato garden, and other types of produce that is earth and floating plants that is tethered above in the middle of the lake and free floats. That means that they can navigate through it. It draws the water straight from the lake, and then they harvest and look after it from their boats. The local market as well it's incredibly safe, and you can walk around, and it's still fully authentic. And I think that's one of the other things that's so beautiful about Myanmar right now, is that it's obviously going through that transition as the economy opens up and gets stronger. But you're still spending time in a culture and in a country where the minimum wage is about $60, and it's not a deeply impoverished country. I mean, poverty of course is there, but it's a country where the people that we met, at least, they seemed like they were doing well, they were healthy, and the economy was working and it was balanced. My concern, of course, is that tourism then brings some level of unbalance and imbalance to that. But what that also means is that when you see photos of people in horse-drawn carriages or plowing their fields by oxen, those aren't some sort of special depiction or posing purely for the camera. It also means that it gives us a much richer opportunity to experience different ways of life, different ways of subsisting, ways that we would otherwise not have the opportunity to experience, and that might otherwise or in other places have already been broken down into more touristic experiences. It also gives the opportunity to, when you go to the market or when you're out in the countryside, to interact with locals in a much more equal sort of way, because you're interacting with their culture as it is, their daily life as it is. And you're coming and you're learning with all of your touristic sincerity and curiosity and interest. And in that way, it's two people coming together and sharing their stories and their cultures, versus a kind of disconnected voyeurism, which is perhaps in many places much more inescapable. These are some of the reasons that I absolutely fell in love with Myanmar, that it surprised me and was so different than what we expected. The people, the food, the culture, the traditions. It is a wondrous place with incredibly warm people and so much to offer. I hope that this has inspired you to go and explore Myanmar sometime soon.